1968 San Antonio World's Fair. This lecture would be called Mexican Americans and the 1968 San Antonio World's Fair. So let's get started. The World's Fair was based in San Antonio, Texas, as you can see on the red dots right here in the images. I just wanted to point out where the actual fair was. One of the dots is showing it's in San Antonio. The other one dot is showing exactly where it was hosted in San Antonio. Right here, this is a tourist map of downtown San Antonio. I highlighted exactly where it's at. This is an interesting point of reference because later on you're going to see redlining maps, and this is the exact site where the redlining map intersects with green spaces of other communities. You've probably seen the Tower of the Americas from the highway, or through tourist maps like this one from SeaWorld. HemisFair, unlike other fairs like this one shown in this image, the Texas Centennial Exposition of 1936, and the second year of it showcasing the Pan American Exposition, which were not recognized fairs by the Bureau of International Expositions. Instead, HemisFair is actually the first World's Fair to be recognized by the Bureau of International Expositions, unlike these two. HemisFair was considered a specialized World's Fair because it was meant to promote Pan-American unity and celebrate the 250th anniversary of San Antonio. Its theme was Confluence of Civilizations in the Americas, which promoted its general theme of Pan-Americanism, as you can see in the postage stamp right here on the left-hand side, and the coin on the right-hand side, which is just a city token nickel that was used at the HemisFair site for restaurants and to go on rides for city employees. HemisFair's participating countries also reflected its general theme. A majority of the countries were from Latin America. To the left, you'll see some of the bigger pavilions, but to the right, you'll see some of the smaller ones. Most Latin American countries that could not afford one would be joined together by different pavilions. One of them was the Central American Pavilion. The other one was the Organization of American States, which was the governing power for the which was the governing power, kind of like the UN, the United Nations, but for the Western Hemisphere. Members of San Antonio Fair Inc. included Henry B. Gonzalez, the first Mexican American House of Representative from Texas, and others would include William Sinkin, or in this case, he's also known as Bill Sinkin. But another one would be President Lyndon Johnson, of course. Lyndon Johnson really wanted this World's Fair for Henry B. Gonzalez. Henry B. Gonzalez was a powerhouse of an individual for the Mexican American community in San Antonio, at least for his generation standpoint. He's a part of the Mexican American middle class, which were reflected in organizations like LULAC or the American GI Forum. However, at the time, Henry Gonzalez was the first Mexican American representative from Texas, so his significance cannot be understated, specifically for the World's Fair, because he's actually one of the first people that comes up with the idea of creating it in San Antonio. In addition, a lot of stuff that we're going to talk about today, he's actually for, one of them being slum clearance. Another one is cross-border communication, which his family ties are a part of. And on top of that was the Chicano movement, which he dismisses in the 1970s during the protests. Obviously, this is in 1968. So we're going to see how Chicana and Chicano protesters actually confronted HemisFair later on. But at the time, HemisFair was the only World's Fair to incorporate Mexican Americans at all different levels. Henry B. Gonzalez representing one of them, all the way down to its workers like Rosie Castro, all the way down to the visitors that actually were courted from San Antonio Fair Inc., the organization in charge of the fair, to, go to the World's Fair. At this point in time, in San Antonio, the Mexican American community represented at least 40% of its total population. In addition, they represented some of its poorest community members, and we're going to see how that really is affecting the World's Fair when it's being produced. In addition, this the World's Fair was a part of the War on Poverty program because it was an urban renewal site. We're going to get into that in a little bit. But President Lyndon Johnson's domestic social programs, also known as the War on Poverty or his Great Society, also enacted some other initiatives like the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 with its main goals of curbing and ending poverty, reducing crime, ending inequality, and improving rural and urban environments. In addition, other programs also were started throughout the War on Poverty, um, throughout LBJ's War on Poverty initiatives. Some of them included Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start for preschool students, elementary and secondary education funding acts, right? AmeriCorps, which also incorporates volunteering service to America, Vista volunteers in communities like in the west side of San Antonio at this point in time. Also was the Housing and Urban Development Act, which creates the HUD department in the White House and for the government. But it also continued federal funding for urban renewal and public housing and home mortgage programs, which has its legacy in the 1930s during the New Deal. One of the more famous urban renewal sites in the US is actually Dodger Stadium. It was formerly known as Chavez Ravine, but it got cleared in the way to make Dodger Stadium. However, like most urban renewal sites across the country, these sites were selected because they were based in communities of color, older communities, or just in low-income areas of the city. And right here, this in where Dodger Stadium is located at, it's located north of downtown Los Angeles. And you can see there's a totally different perspective of this urban renewal site. One to the left is a vibrant neighborhood, Mexican American community, predominantly Mexican American community, and to the right, it was cleared to make space for the parking lot and to make space for the actual stadium itself. So, like I said before, urban renewal has its legacy in the 1930s with the New Deal era programs, and one of these programs was redlining, which is a form of institutionalized segregation because what it does is it denies loan and mortgage insurance for housing and redevelopment in certain neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods were predominantly communities of color, low income neighborhoods, and elderly neighborhoods. However, and by 1933, the Home Owners Loan Corporation created maps that showed their loan mortgage rating system to suggest the best neighborhoods to invest in cities across the United States. And in these maps, which you'll see in a little bit, you're going to see how they rated them. They rated them from green to really good to hazardous in red, and that's where you get the red lining come from, because in these communities where these were historically segregated communities, there is a red line and there is a colored in red side of the map where that neighborhood specifically is. Now, by 1934, the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, created public housing for low income and elderly communities, provided low interest home loans and mortgage insurance for new loans. However, the FHA also denied mortgage loans for African Americans, Mexican Americans, and refused to insure property in the inner city neighborhoods. Specifically, this would happen more after World War II. As troops are coming back, they're applying for these home mortgages as they're getting jobs in the economy in order to create housing for them and affordable housing for them. The FHA provides these loans. However, some of these loans were denied to African Americans and Mexican Americans. They had to go through a court case to actually uphold some of the loans for these individuals. But what that does, and what the Homeowners Loan Corporation does at the same time, is that the FHA uses these maps, right, the HOLC, and sees where not to reinvest in or where to put newer communities basically in the suburbs outside of the inner city, and that's where these white communities would be. It also creates a form of white flight to where white individuals that lived in the inner city moved to the suburbs and were able to get these loans. On top of that, it leaves a huge hole for deinvestment in the inner city. So if a person, for example, wanted to fix up their house that lived in a segregated black community, they could not get a loan to do so, or at least a low interest loan to do so, which means that they would have to spend more money through an outside private loan industry or individual within their neighborhood to actually get that money for it to fix a house. Now, this causes a big de-investment in communities. This also encourages more individuals to leave as there's a dilapidated housing crisis in these communities. In San Antonio, particularly, this happens in the area of HemisFair. But by 1968, this policy, quote, ends, and by prohibiting financing and housing discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, or sex through the Fair Housing Act of 1968. I put it in quotes because it doesn't really solve the problem. Yes, federally it may have ended, but within states and in local governments, these individuals that use this system were still using it for their benefit. One of them being the Realtors Association within certain states across the United States, and through local governments. And that being said, what happens is that you start seeing lines of segregation already institutionalized through the federal government being perpetuated by the 1970s and 80s. And there is still some court cases today that use this as a precedent to fight or argue against redlining and segregation in housing in the United States. Right here you can see a map of Austin, and this is what I was explaining earlier, where you still see redlining happening. One, you see the red areas, which is the most hazardous areas of the community. You see in green, which is the most desirable, aka the best communities to invest in or to reside into. And this also followed lines of previous forms of segregation that were already instilled, but by the 1930s, this gets institutionalized by the federal government. In San Antonio, we start seeing these maps show up too, the same exact year. But if you look to the right and you look to the legend on the right-hand side, you can see that it actually really is looking at segregated communities and where they're concentrated at. Now, you're seeing the next map that they're just not only concentrating in those areas of the city, but you're going to see how that affects other areas around them. And if they're desirable, or if they're the best community to invest in, or if they're the most hazardous. So again, now we look at San Antonio City map, a different legend, same exact pamphlet from the HOLC, but this is a different map of it, right? And so now it's indicating exactly what areas are hazardous, and that extends way more out than what the segregated ones were. One of the declining areas of the city is actually this one right here. Let me pull up my pointer, but this area right here, and this is like the intersection of what the HemisFair site will be later on. Obviously, this is 1934, and this HemisFair doesn't happen until 1968, so that's a 34-year time span. So you can see the community really develop around this area and get congested, especially for people that just can't move out. So that means that it's overcrowding in places. You have a renters society because people can't get a loan to even buy a house within their own community, or there is a lack of housing in their community. So that also affects to why HemisFair actually chose this site right here where I'm pointing on my laser. And this is the site right here. This is a picture, an aerial view of HemisFair and the urban renewal site. That's where it's at. And this, you can still see that there are some houses in there, there's streets and everything. You're going to see this totally change. But this is what San Antonio Fair Inc. was planning when it was creating its urban renewal site. You're like, there is this area right here south of downtown that we can, quote, reinvest in and remove their buildings, the family, the community in itself, to make way for a World's Fair that lasted 6 months. Maria Antonietta Varesval and Lydia Crockwell to the left-hand side, to the far left, or the second to the left, were also a part of the HemisFair story. Both of them are significant individuals of San Antonio. One of them just recently died, which is Lydia Crockwell. She died last year, but she was the first woman mayor of San Antonio. But Maria Antonietta Varesval was the first Mexican-American city council person in San Antonio. That being said, at the time of HemisFair's production, Maria Antonietta Varesval was a worker, a secretary specifically, and a translator for San Antonio Fair Inc.'s legal office under John Daniels. In addition, she remembers the cruel practice of urban renewal firsthand and how it affected her later on in the future. In an interview with Texas Public Radio, she said, "I guess the saddest moment I have of HemisFair is of this lady, Florence Edgar Roberts, who I was told was going to help organize her 100th birthday party at her house. However, upon doing the birthday celebration, the next day, she read in the paper that Roberts was evicted from her house. Within a year, Roberts would die in a new location to where she was removed, but Roberts was the last person to be evicted from the HemisFair site. However, similar stories of eviction circulated across local newspapers, but in the end, all these individuals and families were forced out to create space for HemisFair and other buildings. These included the Henry B. Gonzalez Center, which is what is known as today, a portion of the Riverwalk, Hilton's Plaza del Rio Hotel next to La Villita, the Tower of the Americas. The neighborhood was, at the time, the neighborhood was comprised of over 1,600 people and 1,300 houses, businesses, and religious institutions like the one shown in this picture, which is St. Michael's Church, which later would transfer its location to the east side of San Antonio. With only a few surviving buildings remaining, like Robert's house, as we'll see later on, this new HemisFair site that was cleared for the World's Fair looks something like what the San Antonio Express News report column suggested. A large segment of downtown San Antonio, the HemisFair site, has taken on the appearance of a bombed-out ruin. More than 2 years in advance of its April 6, 1968 opening, the 92-acre site is being rapidly cleared to make way for construction. And here you can see construction happening on the ground. It's really being cleared. There's only a few houses that are there. One of the houses is right there. Some of these, this one is still remaining. So today you can still see it. Another one will be over here and over here. However, by the time the World's Fair starts, by the time everything is being cleared, construction is already underway for other sites. This is the Hilton Plaza del Rio, which at the time was a modern marvel because each room was individually constructed off-site and then shipped to the construction site and placed one by one individually in the hotel area and stacked one upon another, like Legos, really. And this is a picture of it after it's completed. You can still see it today. It's located right across the street from HemisFair. We're going to see some other pictures of areas near it right now. But also there is the Tower of the Americas, which gets built in the middle of the World's Fair site. Like other World's Fairs of the past, like the 1962 Seattle World's Fair, which had the Space Needle as its focal point building in the middle of the fair. HemisFair is a very similar way. Another one that would be in comparison to this would be the Eiffel Tower that was constructed for the 1889 Paris World's Fair. And this right here, you see an image of the completed World's Fair site. Again, it looks totally different from when it was being constructed. From the first image I sent you of the original 92 acres that it was built upon, the houses that were there. It also, a lot of things get incorporated into this, one of them being the Riverwalk extension, as mentioned earlier. They also built a lake around it, right here. As you can see, they also built a big arena in the middle of it that would host concerts. Later on, when the Spurs get placed or bought out and put in San Antonio, this will be their first arena where they play at. And over here, I think in the corner you can see, yeah, you can barely see it, but that's the Alamo right there. This is River Center Mall in the middle of downtown San Antonio. This is the Henry B. Gonzalez Center, right where what is known as today. This is the U.S. Pavilion at the time, but later on it gets created into the federal courthouse for the district that San Antonio serves. This right here is Florence Roberts' house. It became a part of the World's Fair, but it definitely got renovated for it. It housed the Baptist Center for the World's Fair sites, and it still exists today. A couple of years ago, I took a walking tour. I got to go inside. The house was created in the 1800s, but it's crazy that it still exists because it was one of only a handful of buildings that really exist still from the previous neighborhood that was destroyed. The fair was also used to bring Latin American countries closer to the U.S. sphere of influence during the Cold War. The fair reinforced President Johnson's doctrine for Latin American countries in the 1960s. According to the president, the American nations cannot, must not, and will not permit the establishment of another communist government in the Western Hemisphere. In the pursuing years, the president tried to enforce this policy through direct and indirect military action and by promoting peace across the Western Hemisphere. HemisFair, the World's Fair itself, was a result of the latter. This is how the World's Fair gets its name, because it was trying to promote unity across the Western Hemisphere. And as you will see later on, or as you've seen before with some of the buildings, that's why they're named after the Americas, or that's why they have Spanish in them, to promote one, Spanish and commonality between the two countries, but also two, to promote the fact that this is actually a World's Fair based on Pan-Americanism, right? In addition, HemisFair officials made sure to place this language in its funding request to Congress's Committee on Foreign Affairs, one, to promote the containment theory and also to promote the domino theory. In a statement to Congress, San Antonio Fair Inc. explained that the fair would enhance the existing brotherhood between New World nations, bringing them closer, and reinforce common ties and fortified world peace between them, right? The language, even though it doesn't specifically talk about the containment and domino theory, one can really understand that, yes, this is why the World's Fair is happening during the Cold War, and this is why it's a fair of the Americas, especially with the Johnson Doctrine of 1965. Where it was trying to contain the spread of communism, but also not let other countries, specifically Latin American countries, fold under the direction of communism later on. Right? San Antonio Fair Inc. also employed its public relation and participation team to promote the fair in Latin America and Europe, and to bring countries to participate in the World's Fair. Members of this team included Mexican American Ed Castillo and Carlos Freeman, as seen in the pictures in front of you. And they were joined by the governor, John Connally of Texas, right, who encouraged countries to participate in the World's Fair and was a close friend with Lyndon Johnson at the point in time, right? And just a side story, when HemisFair was actually looking for corporate sponsors for it, San Antonio Fair Inc. could not get many, so Henry B. Gonzalez and the officials around the fair had to call John Connally. John Connally then called directly President Johnson, and Johnson got Ford, IBM, and interesting enough, Lone Star Brewery Company to actually be a part of the World's Fair, and actually host pavilions in there and sponsor them. So I think that's like a little additive of how connected these individuals are, and how networking really played a part into creating this World's Fair, especially for Mexican Americans or people working on the ground that needed support from the federal government or from people with bigger networking spheres than themselves. But in addition, Mexico was one of the main Latin American countries San Antonio Fair Inc. wanted to participate in the World's Fair because it was set to host the 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City, and its close proximity to the U.S. Mexico border made the Olympic Committee and San Antonio Fair Inc. agree that the World's Fair would end right before the opening games of the Olympics, making cross-border tourism profitable for both countries. Following this agreement, Mexico Tourist Bureau Chairman Francisco Gonzalez de la Vega accepted HemisFair's invitation. Gonzalez de la Vega was a prominent lawyer, former governor of Durango, an architect of the Mexican Penal Code, and just so happened to be the cousin of Congressman Henry B. Gonzalez on their father's side. Having these familial ties made communication easier between the two countries and made them accessible to open up to having the two events open on different dates and end on different times. When HemisFair finally opened on April 6, 1968, Mexican tourists that traveled north to HemisFair were also welcomed with open arms by the U.S. border officials. But real quick, before that, even though the Olympic Games happened after the World's Fair, it's important to note that during the Olympic Games, which in itself was an extremely unique event, you start seeing depictions of, what was it, civil rights by U.S. athletes, like right here by Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who actually rose up their fists in defiance against U.S. racism and segregation. In addition, after they did this during the Mexico City Olympics, they were banished from the Olympic Games and they had their medals taken away. Now, in my later projects, I talk about this and the connection, especially between the massacre of Tres Culturas, where protesters in Mexico City were massacred right before the Olympic Games. But it's interesting to note that this is the time period that the World's Fair is actually being created and being produced in. And we're going to get to some of these other significant events that happen around the World's Fair too. However, just 3 years before, in 1965, the Hart-Celler Immigration and Nationality Act abolished national origins but increased border security and surveillance, which enhanced the roles of the agency in the borderlands. This also was due to the increase in quote, illegal immigration in the area of the U.S.-Mexico border, but also because of the increased budgets of the Immigration Nationalization Services and Border Patrol that increased the militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border. However, in 1968, the Immigration and Nationalization Services, INS, temporarily changed border policy to grant Mexican nationals easier access to HemisFair. In an open letter to the agency, the INS Commissioner Harlan B. Carter encouraged all Border Patrol officers to treat Mexican tourists cordially, fairly, and with goodwill, and permitted any non-residents of the U.S. that had a border crossing card to stay 10 days and travel to any part of Texas for HemisFair. INS's practices of goodwill towards Mexican tourists enabled the group to temporarily bypass some of the harsher treatments and policies that Mexican laborers and individuals faced in previous decades and during that reign after the 65 Act. Once in San Antonio, foreign and domestic visitors were able to go to HemisFair finally. However, 2 days before HemisFair even started, on April 4th, 1968, the nation was mourning the loss of Martin Luther King, one of the most captivating civil rights leaders of the 1960s. King was murdered outside of his hotel on April 4th, 1968, 2 days before the inaugural opening of HemisFair. As the country grieved and looked for guidance from its leaders, San Antonio civic leaders questioned if they should move the opening day of the World's Fair following his assassination. They worried about the potential loss in revenue due to riots and protests as seen in news reports from Detroit, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. The actions after the loss of King became known as the Holy Week Uprising, with over 196 cities reporting property damage, personal injuries to citizens, and police suppression of protesters. The affair lasted another 10 days until protesters were forced to settle down in some cities following the arrival of the Army and National Guard units. Again, as HemisFair opened, the nation was still mourning the loss of MOK, as seen in these two covers right here. We see the juxtaposition. The left side is a newspaper from San Antonio called the San Antonio Light, and it's commemorating the first day of HemisFair, and it says it's here. However, to the right hand side, we have the Amarillo Daily News, which has both on its cover. The violence plagues the cities after the death of Martin Luther King. And then below that, you start seeing HemisFair gates to swing open today. So you start seeing the different depictions of media depictions of HemisFair during this point in time. However, within the 2 days that MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., died, the city and African American leaders prepared a memorial service and symbolic funeral procession for MLK. The services were meant to ensure that no violent actions were taken or property damage happened in San Antonio while HemisFair opened its gates to the world. Nevertheless, amid the murder of MLK, HemisFair continued as scheduled, making way for tourists to fill hotels and enter the World's Fair on April 6, 1968, as seen in these newspapers. On opening day, around 70,000 visitors attended the fair, and in total, around 6.4 million people entered HemisFair through its 6 months of operation. The Riverwalk entrance was among the many gates that fairgoers could enter HemisFair. And this is the Riverwalk entrance right here on the side. Let me get my trusty pointer. Right here where the stairs go up, and below it, you'll start seeing the entrance to HemisFair. Right here is what we're going to talk about right now. When these travelers went through the Riverwalk space, they got a chance to see Juan O'Gorman's Confluence of Civilizations mosaic mural, which was created in Mexico City, but then shipped and built here in San Antonio for the World's Fair. On top of that, it rested above the amphitheater, which later on we'll talk about, but this amphitheater later gets renamed in the next few decades the Lila Cockrell Theater after the first woman mayor of San Antonio. And at the time, Lila Cockrell also helped create HemisFair. She was a city councilwoman at the point in time that sponsored a lot of bills and sponsored a lot of ordinances to create HemisFair. We're going to look at one of our ordinances right now. Yet, as the same day that they walked through the site, once inside, if the tourists walked west towards Alamo Street, as you can see on this map, so if tourists entered right here, where is it at? Right here. Tourists entered right here, and they walked west toward Alamo Street, they could see the Portuguese, French, and Chinese pavilions. In the background of these pavilions, tourists also saw the Hilton Modular Hotel, and the tramway that took visitors around the fairgrounds. However, if visitors came through the Alamo Street entrance, they witnessed protesters with signs that were demonstrating against the World's Fair. This was the scene of the first day. While some visitors received a warm welcome at the gates, others viewed the opening day as a moment when both the fair's theme of confluence of civilizations in the Americas and its reality in San Antonio collided. Fair goers entering through the Alamo Street gate were welcomed by Chicana and Chicano protesters and African American protesters from across the city and state of Texas. The newspaper Inferno covered the activities of these demonstrators, which included the Mexican American Youth Organization, or MAYO, from San Antonio, and the Mexican American Student Association, or MASO, from Austin, and members of the local National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. While Mexican American officials gained HemisFair support abroad and in the federal government, support for the fair at the home front in San Antonio and in Texas reflected a deep divide between class and race as the African American Civil Rights Movement and Chicano Civil Rights Movement began to form. While this lecture specifically addresses Mexican Americans at the fair, African Americans were present too as workers, fairgoers, and protesters too. In the previous 20 years, San Antonio took slow action to desegregate most of the city. Even when HemisFair was about to open, civil rights leaders still had to convince white downtown business owners to desegregate their businesses for the fair and its tourists. Sorry. Still, the battle for the civil rights was still affecting San Antonio even during the fair. As said before, the significance of MLK's death 2 days before affected whether the fair was going to open a couple of days after scheduled. However, San Antonio Fair Inc. incorporated the death of King through citywide memorial services and lowering the flags at half-staff at HemisFair, one of the first times the U.S. has ever done that for an African-American individual. And at the same time, while they were lowering these flags at half-staff, they had a heavy police force to make sure that protesters did not get out of hand. For middle-class Mexican Americans, the anti-discrimination agenda may have been achieved through subtle political action, but for groups like Mayo and Maso, political participation could be attained through a more direct, aggressive stance, which included protests, boycotts, and school walkouts to highlight the educational residential inequalities in the city. These actions would not only be seen in HemisFair, but also a few days later in the Mexican west side of San Antonio, as high schoolers walked out to protest against educational discrimination, helped by Chicano protesters at the point in time. Chicano protesters. When at HemisFair, Chicanos and Chicano protesters protested against HemisFair and Mexican leaders like Gonzalez because while the city, state, and national agencies funneled urban renewal funds for HemisFair, these same funds neglected Chicano communities in the west side and African communities in the east side. Some even urged, like the sign shows above, that HemisFair was for the rich. Sorry, just hard. Rich. Showing its class disparity in the city. A statement that Inferno supported and argued throughout the fair with monthly reports about the fair, and while encouraging people not to visit it because it costs too much. According to town officials that feared racial protests, these protesters were not allowed to assemble on the streets due to Town Ordinance 3622-2 that made public protests, parades, and assemblies unlawful in a clear violation of the First Amendment rights, which was approved 2 months before HemisFair even started. As a result, Mayo and Maso, like seen in the photographs, had to protest on the sidewalk near the gates. According to Inferno, with this ordinance in place, there were still no arrests made to stop the protesters. But armed guards, like seen in the picture above, and police snipers were standing on the buildings across the street to ensure demonstrators did not get out of hand, especially while foreign dignitaries and the First Lady of the U.S. were visiting HemisFair. And yet still the fair persisted. After visitors passed the protesters, they were welcomed by gate attendants and paid the $2 ticket prices to enter the fair, which in today's money is $44. The ticket price was set by Congressman Gonzalez after he confronted San Antonio Fair Inc.'s chairman, William Sinkin, about the potential loss of revenue if the price of admission exceeded $2. Gonzalez understood the financial hardships that his constituents dealt with daily. The exposition was meant to boost the local economy that needed relief, and a high ticket price did not favor them. At the time, 42% of the Spanish surname population of San Antonio lived below the $3,000 poverty line, and 12% of the total population of the city was unemployed, which was 9% above the national average. When the fair opened in 1968, local newspaper the San Antonio Express tried to convince residents that HemisFair was inexpensive. All one had to do was to pay the entrance fee, but food, drinks, and some attractions would cost the fairgoers money. Even though ticket prices were set at $2, some San Antonians did not know the price of admissions until they were in front of the gate. This happened to Linda Sanchez and her grandmother. In an interview with Inferno, upon reaching the gates, the two individuals were hesitant to enter. Linda told her grandmother that she wanted to get in to see everything and to please give her the $2. At first, her grandma didn't want to give her the money because it was too much and she only had $5 to pay some bills. But she wanted to make her happy, and she took out the $5 to pay the entrance fee. According to Linda, after they entered the fair, the two did not have enough money to buy food or drinks, but instead they chose to visit the free exhibits and pavilions. For workers that entered HemisFair that did not have to pay the $2, they had a different experience when entering the fair. As seen in the pictures above, this is a different world for them, right? According to Becky Barrera, who was a HemisFair VIP guide, she recalls, when entering the World's Fair, we went into a little cocoon for 6 months and explored a different life from our own. In addition to seeing different countries, people could see celebrities such as Grace Kelly, right here, which was the Princess of Monaco at the time, Bob Hope, Louis Armstrong, as seen right here in this picture. This is the Louis Armstrong special guest for the HemisFair Arena. And other celebrities could be Vicky Carr and the President of the United States, whom all attended and performed at the fair at one point in time. Rosie Castro also shared a similar experience at HemisFair's Children's Pavilion and Project Y, the youth entertainment area where she worked. According to her, it was an exciting glimpse into a world beyond San Antonio. In addition to entering the different world, workers and attendees could speak Spanish openly without fear of being punished, as seen in public schools in the Mexican west side of San Antonio. Instead, HemisFair workers like Barrios Zaval, George Cisneros, Becky Barrera were able to move up the fair's management ladder and network and speak with world leaders from Latin America and Europe because they spoke Spanish and acted as translators. For celebrities like Mexican-American singer Vicky Carr, who at the time was a Grammy Award nominee, now Grammy Award winner, from El Paso, the opposite happened. She had a chance to get a glimpse of the reality outside the fair. According to her, I came to San Antonio to perform at HemisFair when there was a knock on my hotel room door. In the hallway stood several students from Holy Cross School, a small private Catholic school on the Mexican west side of San Antonio. Due to its isolation on the Mexican side of town, budget constraints, the students told her that the Archdiocese of San Antonio, who owned part of the property, was going to close Holy Cross High School because it could not afford to stay open. The school was about to close when students asked Carr to perform a benefit concert to help keep it open. Carr willingly accepted and did a performance shortly after their encounter. Still to this day, she remembers this as one of the highlights of HemisFair and a memory that she still cherishes till today. While residents were able to see Carr outside of the HemisFair, those that paid the $2 could see other celebrities and exhibits and political officials inside. Fairgoers could also see political leaders like First Lady Johnson, also known as Lady Bird Johnson, who was also there on opening day to cut the ceremonial opening day ribbon. The president excused himself from attending HemisFair that day as he was held up in meetings over the escalating war in Vietnam, monitoring the Civil Rights Bill of 1968, and was preparing an address for the death of Martin Luther King Jr. While he was in Washington, D.C., the First Lady welcomed visitors and accompanied foreign dignitaries throughout the fairgrounds to reinforce the transnational concept of community. Knowing that HemisFair is part of a broader belief of Pan-Americanism, she had hoped that the fair would contribute to, quote, a better understanding between its peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Nevertheless, as visitors walked around the fairgrounds, the two most popular buildings were the Tower of the Americas and the U.S. Pavilion, as shown in the picture right here. Designed by O'Neill Ford and Boone Powell, the Tower of the Americas became the physical representation of confluence and hemispheric unity. Similar to the Eiffel Tower at the 1889 Paris World's Fair and the Space Needle in the 1962 Seattle World's Fair, the tower was the hemisphere's architectural focal point. Constructed entirely of concrete, steel, and glass, like my grandfather who helped build it, he laid down the first cement of the 622-foot structure that stood as the tallest exposition building in history at the time, of course, but was one of the hardest to construct because instead of using ready-made slabs of concrete to build the structure like you would do in a building, this structure went story by story, meaning that Ford and Powell's team devised a method to continuously pour fresh concrete using a hose system and a 24-hour construction crew to create the tower. Like I said, my grandfather was among one of these construction workers that helped build it and pour it. So day by day, he would go out there funneling concrete into the tower and building the structure with other workers. According to the architect, following a day's work, the concrete shaft would gain at least an average height of 10 feet each day as it moved up, along with the observation deck that was built for it, as seen in the picture right here. However, during the first month of the fair's opening, crews were still constructing the pavilion around it. While visitors waited in line to go up, San Antonio reporter Patrick Canty claimed that while the Alamo symbolized San Antonio's past, the Fair of the Americas symbolized its future. To some people, the tower was a symbol of San Antonio's future, but to other town residents, it reminded them of the urban renewal project that destroyed their community. Irma Mieles swore that she would never step into the tower because that was the site of her family's former church, St. Michael's, as seen in the picture before. Regardless of the massive urban renewal project that took her church, she did visit other. The U.S. Pavilion was one of the buildings she visited often, which was formerly named Confluence USA, which also housed the Confluence Theater, a three-room cinema with retractable walls that once lifted merged the three rooms and audiences together at the end of a 20-30-minute movie. Visitors were able to watch the controversial documentary called U.S. Its directors, Francis Thompson and Alexander Heyman, created the film to show the consequences of America's unwillingness to change in the face of massive poverty, the pollution of the environment, the destruction of its communities through eminent domain, and racial inequalities in 1968. On opening day, Lady Bird Johnson had the opportunity to watch it. After the showing, she claimed that the movie lacked the element of hope because it did not have a solution for these problems. Life magazine writer Richard Schneck described the movie as one of the very few films of any sort sponsored by the government, any government really, that dares to criticize the nation whose taxpayers underwrote it. Others called for its immediate removal from HemisFair, and others praised the movie. Irma Mieles, she saw the film 7 or 8 times because she was really taken by it. Because of its popularity, the film remained in Confluence Theater and for others to watch, like Mieles, to be shown until 2 months after the fair even ended. For those that could not travel to HemisFair or pay the $2 admissions fee, could also see part of HemisFair and the city of San Antonio outside of its gates. One of the ways they could do it was through Charles Ramdell's guidebook called San Antonio, a Historical Pictorial Guide. This was the first time Mexican Americans became part of a World's Fair experience as an unofficial attraction. In his guidebook, he writes very clearly that the quaint and picturesque Mexican west side of town should be a point of interest for visitors for HemisFair. According to him, Latin Americans not only numbered more than half of the city's population, they had now decided in 1968 to take a hand in civic affairs. This was a surprise turn, for until very recently, quote, Mexicans were rarely bothered to vote unless someone in their family had a job at stake, end quote. Ramsdell's depiction of Mexicans in San Antonio portrayed them as not being active in social or political life, only hints at the actions taken by local civic leaders in 1968 rather than acknowledging the racial and political legacy of the Alamo City. In addition, Ramsdell shared his views of the local sites like Guadalupe Catholic Church, which he describes as rather ugly, adding that the church, quote, is a mainstay of the very Mexican or very Indian Catholic who clings to the old customs like oyster clings to shell, end quote. His comments of the ethnic Mexican community continued to perpetuate stereotypes that were prevalent in South Texas society. His guidebook, published by the University of Texas, represented stereotypes towards communities of color that were still prevalent in Texas, even amid HemisFair's message of confluence that it claimed it had. However, depictions of San Antonio's Mexican community did not stop there. A month after HemisFair opened, CBS's documentary Hunger in America showed the reality of San Antonio society. I wish I could show you a video of this, but you can simply look this up on YouTube and you can find it. In its initial scenes, the documentary compares the celebration of HemisFair and the realities faced by San Antonio's ethnic Mexican community. According to CBS, this group lived in impoverished neighborhoods in states of hunger and held limited job opportunities in San Antonio, even amid the war on poverty programs that Lyndon Johnson supported and that HemisFair claimed that it was going to help. These conditions were apparent for leaders like Congressman Gonzalez even before HemisFair, and the televised event just exposed it to the nation. Although members of San Antonio Fair Inc. promised that the fair would fill the economic void of the city and boost job placement, it sadly fell short, as it did not bring either for another decade. In addition, most of the town's Mexican-American citizens could not afford to attend the International Exposition because of the ticket prices. The success of the fair relied on its complete access to San Antonio society regardless of race. While Congressman Gonzalez, concerned about the affordability of the fair, he failed to care for the well-being of his own community during its production by building infrastructure within their communities, like he did for the World's Fair site. In addition, HemisFair's idea of confluence in the Western Hemisphere and in the local community were met with the realities of the world around them. While some Mexican Americans were able to benefit from their collaboration with San Antonio Fair Inc. and the federal government, some were still left out. Once in the city, tourists from across the world were welcomed at the gates with protesters. Although the city had tried to diminish the presence of public demonstrations on the streets through city ordinances, groups found ways to protest HemisFair. Among these were the Chicano and Chicana youth organizations that highlight the hypocrisy of the World's Fair, meant to build up the local economy. Instead, it destroyed an entire community for some, and it was too expensive for others. Those that could afford the $2 cover were encouraged to participate in the free exhibits, even if they could barely afford the price of food. While instead, others chose to protest individual exhibits. Outside the fair, the San Antonio's ethnic Mexican neighborhoods were considered attractions for travelers too. Visitors that did not want to see a part of San Antonio could still catch a glimpse of its CBS Hunger in America documentary today that showcased the Alamo City's class and racial divide of 1968. While some Mexican Americans were able to participate in a HemisFair, a World's Fair that failed to live up to the theme of confluence of American civilizations, others were able to at least place their grievances about the World's Fair outside the gates and inside the fairgrounds by protesting